What you doing over there, buddy?
Just, I don't know, playing with this. If there's knobs in front of me, I'm going to start turning them.
So you think DNS has been abstracted away from developers yet?
No, because we just did it.
I barely had to know about it, though.
There's nothing. No.
I'm on a need-to-know basis.
No. There were 3 people looking at the screen wondering which buttons to click. So no, it hasn't.
I can't wait until it is. I would like to read a networking book. There's this book that I remember getting recommended to me that explained all this stuff, because I've just never. I do that on purpose, need to know basis, and just enough to get by. But sometimes it's like, okay, once it comes up 3 or 4 times, and I literally feel like I'm looking at a physics book and I've never taken physics class, then it starts to feel a little uncomfortable.
DNS is weird. DNS, it's like outdated technology. It's like weird. It's like not secure. It's plain text. There's a bunch of weird things about it.
Is there anything going to replace it?
I think there's been a few attempts. I think there's been like DNSSEC that never went anywhere, and I don't really know the status of all the things, but yeah,
it's just old.
It's
legacy tech.
I mean, I guess there's a difference between like I'm managing a domain with thousands of records and a whole bunch of different app servers and email servers and all that, and I want to set up my blog.
One website, one URL, one record.
Yes. And so it seems like the full thing is often exposed to us, no matter what you're doing.
Yeah.
I don't know what the answer is. There's also a lot of parties involved, right? You have your register, you have the person that hosts your zone, and then you have the actual server that you're pointing to.
Mm-hmm.
So coordinating across all those is, it's hard to optimize that process.
Yeah, and make it feel like a seamless kind of experience.
Yeah.
We're recording at 2 different frame rates, so that'll be interesting, but I'm okay with that. Not frame rates, shutter speeds.
Wait, should we just flip the thing?
I'm at 1/60 and you're at 1/30.
Oh, but they're constant, right?
Yeah, the rate's going to be the same. They're both 30 frames per second, but the shutter speed's different, so you might look like a little shaky cam or something like that.
Nice.
Who knows? Too many moving parts and everything, man.
Yeah.
Domain names, cameras. I just want one button to do my whole life for me. Just push one button and everything's taken care of.
It wouldn't surprise me if these cameras had a DNS server built into them.
My voice is lower than yours today. Low.
Nice.
I had a stogie on a Thursday. It's pretty good. We've been playing with Gatsby. Actually, by the time that this episode comes out, we should have MirageJS.com live on the interweb.
We will.
Yes. So you should be able to go to MirageJS.com and see what we've been working on, which is extracting out the core of Mirage to be used outside of Ember. And that's for a number of reasons, which we'll kind of get to in the next episode where we'll focus on Mirage. But the ultimate goal is to make Mirage better for Ember users and make it better for non-Ember users too. So that's kind of been some of the work we've been doing. But we decided to build that site with Gatsby as an excuse to kind of use it and play with some new tech. And, Gatsby kind of bills itself as being good for making fast websites that are simple. And this is like a pretty simple kind of landing page right now. So we figured it would be good.
Yeah.
You were the one who got it set up.
I'm thrilled with our choice of Gatsby. Going into it, I just kind of knew that Gatsby's good for content sites or good for like your personal blog. I know Dan EmberMap has his blog as a Gatsby app, but that's kind of all I knew.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've been using it for 2 weeks now.
Mm-hmm.
Having done this for 2 weeks, I'm super happy with the choice. So that's always like a good feeling when you get better and better. You feel better and better about your tech stack.
Yep.
I guess before, I should kind of describe what Gatsby is, how it's different from something like Ember or Rails. So Gatsby would you call it a static site generator?
Yeah, basically.
At its core.
Yeah.
But you write your site as basically a React app with a bunch of Gatsby. Gatsby provides a whole bunch of plugins and a whole bunch of default components and a whole build pipeline for you. But you're writing a React app, and then they take that and they generate a static site from it.
It's confusing.
Yeah.
Is that Ember is a static site generator, or at least Ember CLI is.
No. But I would say no, because
so we have to define our terms.
Ember, you're going to have an index.html file that is just like 2 script tags. Just
Right.
I'm being hand wavy
Sure.
here, but that's what you end up with for every single page on your site. And then when the browser downloads that index.html and runs the JavaScript, it kind of figures out based on the URL, oh, what should I render?
Right.
But with Gatsby, it's
Separate.
when you build your app, you're going to have HTML files
For every route.
For every route.
Every URL.
Yes.
So yeah. So just to be more specific, I guess, it is true that a static site is one that is just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in one definition, right? So like when the first static site generators come out, like Jekyll and Middleman, they emphasize static site generator because it wasn't a runtime Ruby process that was processing your requests.
No app server.
No app server, exactly. A content server, which is able to serve up. Now, we've used a content server to serve up our Ember apps.
Yes.
So that's kind of the point you were making, which is that you serve up an app, but you can do it from a content server without an app server because you can just do it statically. Everybody gets the same static files. Yep. So Gatsby doesn't call itself a static site generator because that would be kind of confusing, right? Because like technically an SPA that gets served up from a content server is also a static site, but like you usually don't think of it like that. So what does it actually call itself? It's, I don't know, but basically the point is, the distinction here is kind of what you made.
Listen, we do development, not marketing.
Not
Gatsby.
marketing.
Yeah.
So the difference is is that whereas Ember is an SPA and every single route, it's going to have to download, execute the JavaScript before, like you said, the Ember app figures out kind of which route to render. And then the JavaScript's going to be rendering it, basically, if you use something like Prember in Ember and took it and pre-rendered all of the routes such that you actually had, real HTML and CSS that had the content in it instead of just being bootstrap files that loaded the Ember app, that would be kind of the equivalent to what Gatsby is. Gatsby is actually like that from the ground up. That was the whole point of Gatsby from the beginning.
Yes. And the Prember, great mentioning that, because if you were to build something like Gatsby in Ember, that's sort of the road that you would go down.
Right. There are some cool things that come from this being the kind of the reason for living, the raison d'etre or whatever. Well, for example, if you have an Ember app and you try to start adding Prember and Fastboot, right? Because Prember uses Fastboot to render it ahead of time. And there's something that's broken during the pre-rendering stage that's happening in Node, and it's because you're accessing something that's meant for the browser and it doesn't work in Node, you're not going to necessarily understand why right away. But Gatsby from the beginning is about building like Node-generated static HTML and CSS. And so if you are in a React app and try to access window, they have a really nice build time error message that tells you, and it gives you a nice link to a website that says, oh, here's why this thing might have happened. It's understandable. You're writing React code and you might be used to expecting to be in a browser environment, but actually you're being run in a Node environment right now.
Yep.
So those are like some of the gotchas that when you start using things like Fastboot and Prember get you in Ember, but this kind of has that whole development flow streamlined.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, this is their laser focus. So they get to optimize for all this stuff and not have to worry about other things.
Right.
So,
right.
Yes.
Exactly. So that's pretty interesting. And it's true. And you actually do go pretty far, like not really, because that's kind of still a mind-bendy thing, but like you don't really think about it.
Well, we didn't think about it for the first, a week and a half?
Yeah. And then we actually added, Mirage, like the actual extracted package, which happens to depend on some browser APIs. And that was the thing that actually broke the app in the pre-rendering stage.
Yeah.
And Gatsby develop was working, but then it was broken on production because of the pre-rendering stage. So that's kind of interesting.
Right, because we didn't notice it, so we tried to run Gatsby build.
Yeah, so that's kind of interesting where like Gatsby develop is not actually going to flex that. It's not actually going to, it kind of serves up something different than what's going to be served up in production, but makes for a better development experience. Mm-hmm. So kind of interesting though. It's just interesting seeing a lot of the parallels between the stuff we've been doing the last 2 years with Ember and Fastboot and Gatsby. Yeah. The other cool thing about Gatsby, there's a lot of cool things about Gatsby. The plugin stuff is really neat. Gatsby is intentionally very low level. So things that you would maybe like in Ember, you've come to expect like really easy 1 or 2, step processes to get something in your app. in Gatsby, a lot of times, like I want to do X, and like I'm gonna have to kind of go look at some plugins and read some documentation, like understand a little bit more about how it works. But because they've spent so much time on the kind of lower level primitives and making sure it's flexible, there's like a pretty big ecosystem there, and there's like a lot of packages, that are like thriving, and there's basically like you can do whatever you want. You never kind of feel like you are stuck or limited or hit a wall and you can't go further because those low level things are so well documented and exposed. That's kind of like their focus.
Yeah. And to add to that, this was one of the things I really enjoyed about using Gatsby was that the plugins were really easy to search for. They have a website that's just dedicated, and it's this fast SBA. And it was funny. I would search for something, find something, I'd just be like, oh, I wonder if like this other thing exists, or I can do this. And I was just discovering all these add-ons by doing that. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
The other thing is, you said they're like really low level, and I totally agree there. There's a bunch of official Gatsby recommended add-ons, and those things, like I always felt great, even though they were low level. I always felt great about using those. They had like excellent documentation.
Right.
I kind of know that if they're official, for as long as like Gatsby's around, I kind of, my expectation is this thing's going to be supported.
Right.
It's not just one person that's just going to fall off the face of the earth.
Totally.
Like some GitHub, especially like lower level libraries that you end up using. So
was it like the Markdown one? Was that one of the official ones?
For the first week I was using it, I would only install official add-ons, and I think we ended up doing like purge CSS, and I kind of like went back and forth for like 2 days because it wasn't an official add-on. We ended up using it, and it's been great.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really like seeing that, this is an official add-on. Like
Right.
that made me feel really good. Like
Right.
It just made me feel like, okay, can install this and not worry about it.
Totally. I think one thing we've learned over the last 3 or 4 years, kind of working together, working on open source, building Ember apps, seeing how Ember itself has developed, and then seeing, things like React and Gatsby be very large ecosystems that are popular and used for a diverse set of needs and use cases, is that, ultimately, as much as we love the higher level APIs and the idea of like this really golden happy path for the customer, there's something about being honest with yourself and exposing low level APIs. I think that's super important. So, even using Gatsby and realizing like, yeah, it would be nice. Like I want a blog with like custom styles and Markdown and like text snippets. And like, it would be great if that was just done for me. And it's not like you have to wire together some plugins, but like you also just never, like we said, get stuck anywhere. And even the things that you wire together are like, even though you are technically kind of dropping down one level, a lot of times it's like 4 lines of code, and it's extremely well documented. And I think ultimately it's just a better patch. It's just a better path forward in terms of keeping if you care about the technology you're working on and care about sustainability, being honest about which part of what scope of the problem set you can actually commit to. And so it just seems way better for the Gatsby team, even with the plugins being plugins and not part of the core. If it turns out that they can't support, like maybe the Markdown plugin is too hard to get right, and so then they just, that's like not an official plugin anymore. They just say, we need someone to take over this. And that's way better than just letting it languish on like an official site. Like what if the Markdown thing was built into Gatsby core? It's not going to get the attention that it deserves, right? Because they also have to compete between the core stuff and the Markdown stuff. So it just makes me think of like some of the satellite projects with, things we've done or Ember projects. Like when you don't have ownership of them, it can just languish, right? And they can just kind of stagnate.
So you're okay. So you're saying that because the thing is not part of the library, it forces the library to expose. It forces Gatsby to expose low-level hooks, or low-level primitives, so that you can do things like Markdown rendering and image resizing and all the things, and that allows you to build up this ecosystem of very low-level but doable plugins.
Powerful plugins.
Yeah.
And it is undeniably a trade-off. If the Gatsby team built in Markdown parsing and purge CSS and image magic resizing stuff into Gatsby core, it would be an easier and better process out of the box than what we had to do.
Everything you just mentioned was about half a day for us to set up.
Right, exactly. The problem is that eventually that becomes an overwhelming problem space and you can't commit to support it. So I've been thinking about this also because, as we're extracting out Mirage's core, we have a backlog of features that I haven't worked on for years. People have been asking. And so, again, that's the very real trade-off where it's like, it's awesome, the features that are in Mirage that are baked in, and it's great. You can just import active model serializer, and you don't have to install anything else. You don't have to read how to like add a plugin to Mirage and like configure your Mirage plugin pipeline. Like there's none of that. So that's nice that you can just import it from Mirage or Mirage or whatever. But at the flip side of that, the cost is like there's a lot of stuff that hasn't been built yet. And so thinking forward and wanting, even projects like Mirage or anything else that we work on to be more of this, I just think it's better to think about, okay, what are the actual low level pieces? What if Mirage was like the middleware style with like an Express, and then we have some official Mirage plugins like the JSON API serializer, the active model serializer? What if the ORM is a layer, but people can bring their own? And then you think about exposing those things, making the core much, much smaller and very well documented and extensible. And then that's it, right? Because people have already made like add-ons for like Mirage GraphQL, and they're just having to do that themselves based on their intimate knowledge of how Mirage works. But if there was like proper APIs that were lower level and exposed, it'd be a lot easier for them.
Yeah. And you just said, one of your points there was like very well documented. And I think that's a huge thing with this Gatsby stuff where like, I don't know about you, but I never really felt stuck at any point.
Yeah.
Like I did feel like I was doing a lot of configuration, but I was never debugging.
Yes.
I was never like throwing in a debugger and like inspecting POJOs and seeing how to wire things up. So the wiring up felt way less painful.
Yep.
I was copying stuff off. I was reading blog posts, trying to understand how it worked, and then, setting some props in a config file.
Right.
But I always felt like I was moving forward, which was, it's a really good feeling.
Yeah, no, that's a really good insight. The experience I had with it that was along those lines was about the build time data stuff with the GraphQL server. We can talk more about that in a second.
Yep.
But basically, in the equivalent in Ember is, in Ember add-ons can kind of can read data on the file system level and make it available to the host. So, like the simplest case of this is, let's say, an add-on that imports a node module and makes it importable by like require.js in the browser for the Ember app. But like we do a lot more things with our add-ons, right? Like, even like the markdown, even like what add-on docs does, where it looks at your markdown files or it reads your code and it runs like all the code comments through the JS doc stuff or the ES doc stuff and then provides as JSON to the thing. So that whole idea of like, I'm going to install an add-on and this add-on is going to like scrape your source directory, read your code comments, turn it into structured JSON, and then provide it in a way such that the host app can consume it and know how to get it. That's a very complex process. And in Ember right now, not many people know how to do that because it's not very well documented. The lower level stuff isn't really, it's exposed, but it's just not documented that well. And, you end up kind of just using code search on Ember Observer or pinging like the handful of people who kind of do this or looking at popular add-ons that do this. But it's not like a first party thing. You certainly can't just Google for this thing. Whereas this is like, because Gatsby is lower level, this is a very well documented part with the primitives kind of been thought through, iterated on, multiple times. And so I wanted to do something similar where I wanted to take I wanted a snippets directory in our app and just to throw some snippets in there and grab them and make sure that I could transform them and add syntax highlighting with Prism and do all that stuff. And it was like a quick Google and a documentation page. And, I tweeted about this. There's like a 4 or 5 line node function that does the backend part and it adds it to like the stock of data that's available to your React app to query. And then the query part was like this query that was the same way you query any data, which is with GraphQL. And so that was an example of like how, this is lower level tinkering that I typically like to avoid if possible, obviously, if things work for you. But that being the alternative to just you being stuck and feeling like you don't know what the next step is the insight you mentioned. I think that was really like hit home for me. So it's like, do I want someone who has a GraphQL app to be able to install Mirage and just have it work for them without any extra steps? Yeah, ideally, but like that's not the trade-off. The trade-off is like not having it at all versus having maybe someone else wrote something or it's not quite exactly how I'd write it, but that's fine, and then they don't get stuck.
I mean, the nice thing about designing the plugin interface or those lower level primitives is maybe you can you can nudge them in the right direction. Because right now, I'm sure folks that are writing like GraphQL adapters for Mirage are just, they're going to town.
Right, exactly.
Because they have to basically scan the code base and find every little hole that they can kind of dig into.
Yep.
But you know, if there was like that lower level thing,
yep,
you could nudge them towards, do it like this.
Totally. I mean, I'm just thinking kind of off the top of my head, you know, Ember Data obviously has a ton of stuff that the team wants to do. What would it look like if the data layer in Ember, or even Ember Data itself, you know, didn't try to be as ambitious in the beginning and just nailed some of the lower level stuff? What if the ORM was like decoupled from like the identity map part of it, or like the query interface? What if like the query themselves was like something that was more exposed? And of course, you can configure a lot of Ember Data, but it also makes a lot of assumptions. What about Ember Animated? Like Ember Animated, there's lots of like open issues right now for like little edge cases. What if, you know, instead of going straight to the animators and like dropping in animated each, which is incredible, like that is the API you want to end up with. But what if you allocated time away from that and towards the first things, which are like just holding a thing in place while you move from one thing to another, or like the motion class, or the easing, like there's a motion class that you use, and like just making that something that's more well documented and available, or like some of the other lower level primitives. And it's gonna be more wiring and more coding to get those things working, but people are gonna build up the higher level abstractions on top of it. So
interesting. I wonder if as Ember developers, we get stuck in the mode of like, I want to build the thing that just works perfectly for everyone.
I definitely think we do. I think it's kind of part of our values is that we should feel empowered by our tools. And what we mean by that is like people who aren't as familiar or intimately knowledgeable about a thing can do something they couldn't before. And certainly I feel like that with Ember Animated. When I drop an animated each and I have no idea how it's working, it's great. And it's not great when you hit a roadblock and there's no way out of it, right? Or with fast boot, right? It's the same thing. Like, again, the golden path that you start with is like ideal in your mind, like install ember.js fast boot, do this thing, and like you just have it working. But like the reality is you hit walls and you need to dive down. So maybe it's better to start with the primitives first. And so it's just about, you know, it's just about the fact that it takes time to get there, and the end result will be different. It won't be as smooth as you'd like, but the alternative might not be the smooth thing. The alternative might be running out of resources, not sustaining the project, or never being able to do the vision that you had.
Yeah.
So,
or just ending up like, I know with some stuff I've written, I get the API wrong. It's high level, and then I want to be backwards compatible.
Right.
And now it's just like, boom, tons of maintenance work.
Right.
So, yeah.
And I guess technically like higher level APIs should be easier to like change the internal implementation. But like the problem is if you get it wrong.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's the real thing.
Yes.
So I think it's better to like, you know, Redux was like done after Dan finished working on it, even though it was extremely low level. And people have built a ton of stuff on top because it needs to solve all these other things. Asynchronous middleware thunks and, you know, all sorts of things. That one could argue should be part of Redux, but they're not. And it's because, it's just the reality is like, it's too hard to build the last thing, the last X, and just have it work. I think it's just too hard to do that, and things change fast. So it's better to say, we don't know what's going to be around in a year or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. And so this time, here's one little way we can contribute. We want to make a dent like this, and here's the smallest way we can do it. Let's put it out there and see what happens.
I like that because you definitely do want to build the last X. You want to build the last data store identity map, but it's really, really hard to do.
Yes.
So I like that thinking of it like that.
And so I think Gatsby's embraced that philosophy, and because it's not going to be as easy or as nice to use as like WordPress. Like it's not. WordPress is like way higher level. You like browse things, you push a button, and now you have comments on your site. Like Gatsby's not that. Even for a developer, Gatsby's not as nice as like Rails or Ember, right? Whereas Rails is like, oh, you need to mail things. Oh, now you can test mails. You can send mails. Like, here's how you write tests against them. It's all extremely high level and batteries included.
I mean, even something like Middleman is
right.
way easier to write than Gatsby. But, you know, I think Gatsby definitely unlocks some stuff.
Yes.
So that's what makes it exciting.
Yes.
But yeah.
Hey everyone. So I want to take a quick break to thank a sponsor for this week's episode. It's actually our first sponsor of the show, and that is TrueCoach. And TrueCoach is actually hiring Ember developers. I got a chance to sit down with Alex Ford, their lead front-end engineer, and I wanted to share a bit of that conversation with you so you can hear about what they're looking for. Cool, man. What's the weather like over there?
It's lovely. It just got into the 80s.
Wow.
And it's late June.
So tell me about the positions that you all are hiring for right now.
We are looking to hire positions for our web team. So we're looking for Rails engineers. We're looking for Ember and JavaScript engineers.
What's the main thing that the app does? What does it look like and who uses it?
We provide a workout builder and a set of templates for you to create programs that you can assign and individualize for your client. And a client typically works from a mobile device, right? Mm-hmm. I'm a client, I'm in a gym, probably have spotty Wi-Fi, if any Wi-Fi whatsoever, and open up the app and I have a list of, say, 7 or 8 workouts to do that day with demo videos and do them, maybe record myself, message my coach, hey, here are my results, this was super hard, I'd like to try this. And so we're really trying to solidify the communication gap and the feedback cycle between a coach and a client.
What would be one of the first things that a new Ember dev on the team would be working on?
We really love to start engineers off with testing. I'm hoping that by the time somebody starts, we get to focus on something from scratch. Mm-hmm. A brand new feature, we're looking at volume tracking, which means like tracking sets, reps, weight, tempo, and nutrition tracking, third-party integrations with, say, HealthKit and MyFitnessPal.
Wow, you weren't kidding about the feature list that y'all have.
We just want to build application code. Ember has solved so many of those hard problems for us that we can just really focus and hone in on that.
That's so cool. Tell me a little bit about what it's like to work at TrueCoach.
We hire honest and transparent people who love building a product and who are customer-centric, but don't take themselves too seriously. Our co-founders are so bought into Ember, which for an Ember dev is fantastic. And they want to continue to grow our Ember team, which is one of the more ambitious parts of our platform, of our app suite.
Tell me a little bit about some of the people that you work with. I know Casey. Actually, cool story about TrueCoach, which used to be called Fitbot. Casey, the co-founder who was the original Ember engineer on the app, I still remember one of the first kind of big companies that for me was big of someone using Mirage in their Ember app, and that was Fitbot and Casey, and he kind of sent me a Twitter message saying, this was like soon after like Mirage first came out, and he was like, Fitbot is an Ember app that uses Mirage. And I was like, what? And I went to the website and I looked at it, I was like, this is real? Like, I can't believe that. It's so cool. And that's kind of how cool. I first met Casey. And, ever since we've hung out at the Ember comps, and last year I got to hang out with all you all, and we had lunch together, and it was an awesome team. So yeah, why don't you talk about some of the actual people you work with?
One of my favorite people to work with is Emily. She was our second Ember hire. It was so obvious that we need to hire her immediately because of how great of a person is and her product knowledge just right out of the bat. And it's someone who just picked up Ember having known React from code school and just really ran with it, worked on it for probably about 1.5 years, and then jumped over to the React Native app.
That's really cool, and I also think it's a testament to y'all's culture, because not everyone who's fresh out of a boot camp can be successful at every job. There's lots of places that aren't set up for those kinds of people to be successful. So that tells me a lot about how y'all are supporting each other, supporting new hires, and the fact that someone can work there for multiple years and grow in their own career at one place, I think is pretty unique these days. And the whole team is there in Boulder?
We are, yeah. We're all here in Boulder. We're looking to hire in Boulder, in Colorado. We've got a few folks who live in Denver, if you're into more of a bigger city scene, and we've got a flexible work from home policy, which tends to work really well for our team right now. So it's really cool being in Colorado right now. At the Dinosaur.js conference, there was an electricity. It really feels like an emerging tech market.
If folks are interested and want to learn more about the job posting, where should they go?
I think just check out bit.ly/TrueCoachDev. That's going to link you to our engineering culture. If you think that sounds interesting, there's a link below. Just click the We're Hiring link. Yeah, check it out.
Awesome. We'll make sure to link that in the show notes as well. Alex, thanks so much for your time, and look forward to seeing you again at maybe EmberConf next year.
Appreciate you having me on.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye, Sam.
Let's go back to the you were talking about like using GraphQL.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go back to that because that was one of the things I think that just blew both our minds.
Definitely. So because Gatsby ends up with a bunch of index.html files, basically, right, for all your different routes, but it still wants you to be able to use like the power of like React and like a dynamic environment to build your thing. So it's not a runtime dynamic app. So if you add a comment and reload the page, like it's not going to be there because there's no server there. Now you can make your React app like talk to a different server and pull data from it. But if you're strictly within Gatsby's architecture, the data that you provide to your site can come from like anywhere, but it's going to be at build time, I think. So you can imagine like EmberMap's website would actually be a great candidate for this because we change it, a handful of times a week. We don't have comments on there right now. We used to, but we don't right now. And so there's actually nothing really real time that needs to be displayed on the site.
Yeah, and even the stuff that is like
the play labels, I guess, now.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Mm-hmm.
Or like your billing information, or your teammates. That stuff we don't need to server render. We could load that in.
Right.
That could be like the client could be responsible for that sort of stuff.
Right. But like the pages, if you think about like all the videos and the podcast pages and the
home
transcripts,
page, yep.
because they don't change that often, it's, and what we already do is basically pre-render those and put it in a cache.
Mm-hmm.
So Gatsby would do that at build time. And let's say that we are providing all that data with an API. So the way Gatsby does this, gets the data to actually pre-render your pages in Node at build time, is with a GraphQL API. And so Gatsby has APIs for, here's how I go and fetch this data, and then I kind of do some normalization, and then I put it just in this, what's it called, the data, can you hand me my phone while I'm thinking about this, because I just want to look it up, it's over there. But it's called like the mesh. It's called like the data mesh.
They have a name for this.
Yeah. And the idea behind the mesh is like you basically have data sources from all over. You could pull data from your Rails API. You could also pull it from like flat files in your app, in your source code, which is like what Dan Abramov's blog does, right? Mm-hmm. But you want to think about it as like a data provider, and that you need to do a transform to get it from an API, from Google Docs, from flat files into the mesh. And the reason for that is because the way you actually get the data from the mesh to your app is with a GraphQL query.
Yes. So just to like repeat that back, like you're generating these static sites and you probably have some dynamic external data, and your first thought might be like, oh, well, I'm going to render these video pages, so I'm going to do like an AJAX request to EmberMap's API, and then run that AJAX request in Node. So it's really like a network request, but it goes to an API server, parses the JSON, and then just inserts it into this Node app, and that's how I generate the static content for my site.
Right.
And then maybe I have like comments from this third-party service, so I'm going to use their plugin to pull out that data, and it's going to somehow talk to that. But this idea is like, no, your app, like your static site, only pulls its data from one source, and that's GraphQL, the mesh.
Content mesh is what they called it.
Content mesh.
Mm-hmm.
And then how you get data from all these other external services, they all flow through. Their job is not to put content in your HTML, if that
Right.
makes sense. Their job is to put content in this content mesh.
Right.
And then your HTML, your React components have a great API for querying that mesh.
Totally. And it's pretty cool. And, I haven't used GraphQL a ton, but just reading, kind of following vicariously people on Twitter over the years who have started using GraphQL, one of the big places that it's been successful in companies is that, companies that have multiple APIs, maybe legacy APIs, that makes it hard for the front-end developers to query. And there's a back-end team that basically is layering a GraphQL API on top of that and coalescing it all and providing a unified interface. And so that's basically taking that idea here, and it's like a great notion for it, because instead of like writing a Jekyll site and saying, okay, well, we have a blog post coming from markdown files, here's how you get those. Oh, and then we'll have a comments coming from here, here's how you get those. Oh, and then also I want to get some metadata from like my package.json file, so I can like show on my project site the version, how many issues I have. Like maybe I'll query GitHub's API and do that. And instead of putting like a fetch call in your React component that hits GitHub's API and then renders it, you don't do that. Like you never do that. You can, but that would be a runtime thing. The way you do it the Gatsby way is you create a new node function that will run fetch in node, query graph GitHub's API, and then take the issues, let's say the issue count is what you want to display, and put that into the content mesh. It will add a node to the content mesh, and then your React app will query like whatever you called it. Like it can now just query something called GitHub and like issue count, and that's something you just defined yourself.
Yeah, and one of the amazing things about this is such a good contract for like plugins, authors of plugins, and users of plugins. So going back to before, like all this stuff is low level. You're going to have to install a whole bunch of plugins and configure them. Well, then like basically if every plugin is putting its data into the mesh and use a developer pulling it out of this content mesh, like that's an awesome contract. That's
right.
You don't have to like, oh, this plugin does it like this,
Exactly.
this does it like this. And I, when I was searching around for plugins, I found one that like pulls, it's like gets your images that already exist on S3 and lets you use them in your Gatsby app. And they have this whole spiel about like, oh, it's actually going to go through GraphQL and you're just going to pull everything out through GraphQL. And they were sort of like defending this thing, and they were saying like, well, why not just query the AWS API directly from like your front end code? And a lot of the stuff we just talked about. But I loved when I saw this, I was like, oh, this is awesome. Like, this is awesome. I already know how to use the GraphQL, the use static query.
Right.
This is so cool. And that made me really excited.
Because you just get to leverage that existing knowledge no matter what.
Yeah. And I don't care that like, I don't like, yes, I could use AWS's JavaScript to query it directly, but I don't care. Like this is so much nicer. And the fact that like the add-on author is like pushing me towards this, it like feels really good.
That's awesome. So the way it happened for me was like doing that snippets thing, and I wanted to use Prism to manually highlight it in JavaScript. So like the kind of default markdown way we were doing that, I was just kind of hacking on something myself because I wanted a little more control. And I had to get the snippets files and their contents into a place where I could query them so that I could like run Prism at runtime and highlight them, basically is what I was trying to do. And I did the same thing where it's like, I was trying to think, oh, how did I do this in add-on docs? How did I do this in my Ember add-ons? And here there was just a node function where I get to like create a new node as part of the mesh. But like other than that, it's kind of on my own. And I was like, okay, well, I'm in Node and I can use like fs.readFileSync and I can read in the contents. And that's all I care about right now. So I'll just throw that contents onto a node. And then we haven't even mentioned this fact, which is the fact that to query it, you use GraphQL, but there's a viewer built into Gatsby Develop. And so what you do is like Gatsby Develop pulls up your site at localhost 8000. And then if you go to like localhost 8000/_graphical or something, you get like the graphical thing. And now like no matter what plugin you install, no matter what custom node code you write, you now just see your whole API. It's discoverable. You can just click on things and you just use that thing. Oh, okay, I want to get all of the files, but I want to filter them by their path and make sure that there's a snippets in it. Okay, so I'm going to do that. And I'm just getting feedback the whole time. And it's discoverable. I didn't have to look up how to do it because it's just discoverable, And then
you can write the whole query without typing a single keystroke.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you will, but yes, exactly. You would type out like the dynamic parts, but you can click stuff, open stuff up. Yes.
I mean, just the fact that you can query and filter by regex, and I didn't know that, and I didn't have to go read about that. I could just do it by clicking a few things. And then I want the name of the file, the name of the snippet, which is the file name in this case. And which like Gatsby also does a great job at just like exposing all of like the stat information on a file on the file system level to the API. So you just already have that stuff. And then the contents, which is what I manually added as a node. And then the query was done, throw it in my React app. And now I'm like able to just work with that stuff at runtime and render it with Prism. So that whole process really blew me away just because of the Broccoli work and the Ember CLI work I have done. And, the architecture being there is good, but like just the fact that usually, again, there's a lot more time involved with like doing code search or looking at how I've done this before. The kind of self-documenting discoverability aspects of it, and just that abstraction point, everything goes in the mesh, whether it's comments and blog posts or whether it's like a plugin that's transforming, it's all the same, you know? Whereas when you talk about normally how do you get data into an app, there's many different ways. So I really like that part of it. It was really, I was like blown away by that.
Yeah. Similar to your experience, I was working on our SEO images. So one of the things was like the OG image tag, and having an image that was on the file system, but then was put into that content mesh, and me being able to query it and then resize it and optimize it was pretty amazing.
Yeah, just through the query.
And and I only use like the visual builder to do this.
But it showed like width, and so you knew you had that available to you, so you could just click width and say, okay, actually I want 150 pixels.
Exactly. It felt like
that's crazy.
It felt like programming without programming. So like programming through like a GUI or UI. Yeah. But it also didn't whenever you think of that, you always think of like something really dumb, right? Like something that's like talking down to you. It's like, oh, drag the if statement over here. Oh, do like it's like childish almost. Where this there were just a ton of things exposed. There was nothing.
Yeah, it was the opposite. You felt like you were more empowered and more powerful, and you could do more than if you were just sitting at a blank terminal screen or something like that.
Yeah, I didn't feel like they were treating me as someone that didn't know how to program, but I also felt like I was programming without programming. Yeah. So that was really cool.
I think it's also interesting because, I think when we have talked about GraphQL in the past or read about it or watched talks about it, we always think about it as compared to REST, right? Because we write REST APIs, we like relational databases, and REST is basically like exposing a relational graph over an API, building something with something like Rails and MySQL. It's like, for us, there's a lot that's very well understood about that, and especially when GraphQL first came out, some of the ways that people talk about it make it seem like it's GraphQL versus REST, which is implicitly going to trigger you and be like, oh, but like there's all these guarantees I get with relational data stores, and like there's so much well understood, and now we're just going to throw that all away. I think after working with GraphQL in the context of Gatsby, I realized that's not really the right way to think about GraphQL, or even as a comparison with REST necessarily. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the episode, which is like, if you were going to make a low-level primitive and you had this idea for a content mesh, which is like, okay, we want a vibrant plugin ecosystem to exist, and therefore we want one way to get data into a single source and one way to get it out, then immediately, like, it's not about like REST versus GraphQL is kind of not the right question. Like, if you were going to design that low-level primitive, you would be thinking about like the most flexible query language, and you'd be thinking about something that doesn't have like conventions and constraints, because like this is purposefully low-level and extensible. And so like, even though I love REST and want relational graphs of data for my applications, like this felt so perfect for this. Like, I was adding custom nodes that I was calling anything, and they were showing up in the graphical viewer, and there's no schema there like that is relational or in the normal way of, but it was fine. It made total sense.
Yep. That right there was, by the way, that was great, because when you're saying that, like, we know a ton about REST, we've been building relational apps, GraphQL comes out, and we have that triggered reaction. Yeah. And I think that gets like, the reason that comes out is because when folks are talking about GraphQL, they're not talking about the stuff you just said. They're not talking about like, oh, how can we build a discoverable schema?
Right.
How can we build like this graphical interface to get the progressive disclosure? Instead, they're saying things like
REST sends data, or REST, every time you want to add new data, you have to add a new endpoint.
Yes, exactly.
All those things.
And our response to that would be like, no, you're just designed an awful REST API, and you're blaming your problems on REST, but it's not REST's fault. But yes, this is a real argument.
Right.
Is like these lower level things that get exposed. Yes. Right. Really well said.
So thank you. So I just think it's more like, again, I think people can go too low level and not understand. Like, this happens to me all the time. I come across tools all the time, and I'm like, I hate the person who wrote. I hate you, because you're like making me type in awk or sed or grep, and I'm like, I have no idea what I'm doing right now. Like, do you not care? You have no empathy for me at all. Then it's like the Ember side is like the flip of that, where you have total empathy with like what you're trying to do, but you don't, again, it's like an honest admission about what you can accomplish, and like, let's expose the lower, let's make some sacrifices on the higher level nice API stuff so that we can just be honest and say like we need to expose lower level stuff. So I just think that's really interesting, and that's probably going to be like a theme that just is probably going to keep coming up for the rest of my career, in the sense that like that's such a hard balance to know. That is basically like, I mean, it's another way to say that is how do you write good abstractions?
Yeah.
And it applies to code as well. You know, I'm even thinking about kind of the UI components that we played around with in our app a year or two ago, and how we're writing Tailwind now. And a lot of the same lessons apply, where it's like, there's a dose of humility sometimes that says like, you know, Ryan or even Sam 6 months from now is going to be building a new site for an email course, and he's going to be using your title thing, and you haven't thought about something. So what is he going to do when he hits the case that you haven't thought of?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Not let's try to think of that case
Yes.
and solve it. But yeah.
Let's
what
acknowledge that we won't be able to, because the problem space is so hard. And so what is the escape hatch from now? Like, what is that escape hatch? And let's build that first. And then if there's a point in time where you've had stable software for 2 or 3 years and no one's ever used an escape hatch, that's great. Then you don't document it anymore. And, you know, no one ever needs to have that ugly API or whatever.
You know what's funny? Like, I can recognize this stuff after the fact, and I can relate to what you're saying.
Yeah.
But at the time of writing code or writing an abstraction, I can never get this right. Like, I don't have like a little rule that
Right.
I can, a little saying. I
Like,
can
we're
put in my
about to
head.
publish a new version of Storefront. Okay, what happens when someone runs into something using query, like find records, and they need, you know, to use something that's not an attribute or a relationship? Like, maybe that's all it takes, right? It's just asking those questions before you do it. Like, maybe there's a way to ask a question like, okay, what happens when this is not, like, there's a new situation for this use case?
Yeah. I feel like, but I have like 20 years of buildup of like trying to predict that situation and then trying to solve it before I publish a new version, where it's like I have to reframe the thinking.
Because that's what programmers are so good at, right? One of the things that programmers are so good at is like thinking about every edge case and all the contingencies. I mean, think about that picture of like programmers in a room with product people and users and the owner of the company, and they're like, all right, well, let's make a page with like an email form and sign in. It's going to look exactly like this. The programmer is going to be like, okay, what happens if they put in an invalid email address, or what happens if their internet connection goes down, right? Because we deal with that stuff all the time. So it's almost like we pride ourselves on knowing every possible contingency. But then, like, when you think about exposing these like low-level libraries that are going to be used in so many use cases, then it's like you really want to ask that question of like, what are the things we're not thinking of?
Maybe it's like something like if you're going to add an abstraction to your application, maybe there's a question that's like, well, if my users of this library wanted to recreate this abstraction, how would they do it? And then that kind of lets you know, like, how well does your abstraction decompose?
Yep.
And maybe the answer isn't like, oh, they take a 1-line call and turn it into a 2-line
Right.
call. But maybe
It's 1 to 4 or something.
yeah,
like
or
that.
maybe it's like they can, you know, copy and paste the entire function and it's 10 lines.
Totally.
But it's like, how, if they were to recreate this abstraction, because they need to change something internal to it, how would they do that? And there's things about Storefront that's like, oh crap.
As soon as you go down, then you're done. Like,
as soon as you go
don't-
down one level, it's like they're going to have to recreate a service.
Right.
They're going to have to do. I actually
That's
like Ember
really good.
Data. Ember Data is good here too. It's like if you need to change something about the identity map in Ember Data, like how much code would it take to recreate that? And
Right.
The answer is a lot.
Right. Storefront has like record queried and record queries. And that's always been implementation details. But you could totally imagine that being the low-level thing that you expose, and here's how we use it to build up load records and load all.
Exactly.
Or load record.
Right. And if you need to change the behavior, how
Yeah.
load record works, just because something is
haven't thought about it
non-standard,
yet.
but
Yeah.
you have this problem, you need to do it. Well, the answer would be we don't support that, but that's not the question. Should be what would they have to duplicate to actually do this?
Yeah, and if you expose the lower-level things, then you do support it. It just takes more work.
Yep.
So those are the two trade-offs. We don't support it. Let's open an issue and track the feature request and deliberate how best to do this, or like admission that we hadn't thought about that when we first wrote this, so you can just drop down to this thing. Yeah. Actually, Ember Animated does a really good job at this, because if you look at how animated if, animated value, and like animated orphans are implemented, they're like 4 or 6 lines, basically the gist of them, that use animated each under the hood. So like animated if is just an animated each, with animated each is like the primitive thing, and the rest are built on top of it. So that's a great example where animated each is actually the escape hatch for those things, and you can use it in a more powerful way in other situations. Then the question becomes like, okay, what about animated each? How is that implemented? And what's underneath there, and how much would it take to recreate that in my app so that I have access to these lower level things as well? So like, that's a really interesting point. And so yeah, Gatsby feels like really mostly low level things and then a few high level things, right? Mm-hmm. But those low level things let you kind of build on top of it. So it's pretty much weighted in that direction, but that makes sense given their goals and the goals of the project. And I also think I think the lesson and one of the takeaways for me is like, even if your goal is to provide a high level thing, you should think hard about your unwillingness to expose the low level things, because that might threaten the sustainability and viability of your project. Because if you don't, it's going to be on you to build everything. And
and you're going to get burned out.
Or you're just not going to, Mm-hmm. Adam did this with Tailwind. Tailwind had a container class in the pre 1.0 version, and it was the only thing that was not a utility, basically. And so he's like, wait a second, there's like something here. So now it's a plugin. It's the only default plugin, but there's a whole plugin system that you can use to recreate container or any other like multi-utility class that you want.
Cool.
And plugins let you do a lot more stuff, but that's partly where that came from, because it was like, I want to provide a container class. Like, container feels good, but it also is like higher level than this stuff. And how would you recreate this? And so that's a great example.
It's funny, and the things that we're talking about today, Tailwind, Gatsby, Mirage, they've all kind of this idea of like plugin or middleware thing. So maybe that's like one little thing. It's like, how I don't want to provide a plugin system because I just want to solve people's problems. But not saying you should do this for every library, but what would it look like if my library provided a plugin system?
Yep. I also think, I was just going to say that, like, you also don't have to, it has to be the end of the world. Like, you don't have to sit there and, now you have a whole new thing to think about. How am I going to expose these lower level things? Like, just take a page out of the book that all these people are doing, whether it's even like Gulp and Grunt, or Ember with add-ons, right? Or Rails with engines. Like, the notion of like an add-on or a plugin thing usually applies to like many different situations. With Ember CLI deploy, it was like, instead of providing ways to do all the things, we're just going to define the pipeline with the 5 steps and a common interface so that the plugins can take care of it. And again, Mirage, I could just, instead of I don't have to like try to think on my own about the best way to do this. Like, Mirage is a server. How does normal servers handle this? Middleware. Like, middleware is like a very established way that's composable. It's a common interface, and you could provide like third-party middlewares very easily. So it's very easy to think how that would work. I think there's something there where it's like, you don't have to think about it on your own either. Just take a look at the things that are working very well and copy those. Nice. So Gatsby is really cool. So I guess we've answered the question that was in the back of my mind, which is like, should Mirage become like this lower level thing that has a better, well-defined interface? And I think the answer is yes. Also, like, we've kind of been ragging on Ember a little bit, but like, I think Dave totally, the whole keynote this year at EmberConf was basically about this point. The whole idea behind rationalizing the primitives and exposing lower level things and allowing more experimentation. Like, this is something that we've also learned being in the Ember community, and the lessons that the Ember community has learned from the fact that they do have such awesome, ambitious goals to make an amazing developer experience. But the reality is, like, the problem turns out to be 100x harder than they thought, or whoever thought originally. And so I think that's what a lot of people are learning. But then again, it's still threading that needle. Like, one of the reasons Vue is so popular, I think, is because it provides a nice high level experience that maybe was missing from like just React. I know a lot of people like Vue who felt React and its ecosystem was low level. So there's a balance, and high-level APIs, when they work, are really, really nice and make you feel really productive. I've always felt like that with Rails. My usage of Rails, I've never basically run into a situation where it's like,
yes, same. I mean,
I'm stuck. And now some Rails libraries maybe, but like Rails itself, it's never been like, and there's so much there that's going on that I have no idea about, because I learn things on a need-to-know basis. And the servers I write, usually I just barely get them by, or I just let you write them. No, but for real, I've used Rails in a very constrained way, and so the high-level APIs have always served me, and that's been a really great experience. It even goes to the DNS and the Netlify stuff we were talking about. Like, it's you need to use a subset of like the power of like DNS and hosting and stuff, and you can really optimize that. And if you don't ever hit an edge case that you need to go lower level, then it's like great.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talking about Rails, and I kind of have this question: like, is Rails like the last ORM that you need? And I think the answer there is close to yes.
Yeah, I think so too. I think so too.
And so I think that's like,
because a lot of times, and sorry to cut you off, but like a lot of times in Rails with like its data modeling, and people are like, oh, Rails doesn't handle this thing, but usually your problem is better served. I've never had a problem that wasn't better served by like restructuring the data in a way that fit within Rails domain model, because it's extremely flexible. It doesn't let you do anything, but that's the point, and it's usually better to do it like that. And so that to me is like the answer.
Yeah, it's not. Can you come up with an edge case where this won't work? It's just, do we need to totally rethink the ORM?
Right.
And I think the answer there is no. I think Active Record is nice and battle tested. So just along those lines, there's a lot of stuff in the front end world where we can't say yes to. Like, is Fastboot the last server side rendering? The answer there is no. There's so much. It's not. This isn't a dig on Fastboot. There's just so much about server side rendering that like we haven't explored. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, even like what Now is doing, where they're like splitting your app on route. So like Now it takes a position that like your app shouldn't even be responsible for like navigation from a top level entry point to like specific route, because that is a fundamental bottleneck. So it might turn out the way we write applications is completely different.
Yeah.
Where your application doesn't have a router because of some now I don't necessarily think that's true, or like necessarily think that's might be like the one size, but anyway, the point is like that's something that hasn't been fully explored, and that's something that they're working on. But that would really change a lot about this stuff.
Yeah. And so the answer there is like, are we done with routing? Is there a last router? No. So it's interesting. It's like those are the things that it's like Storefront, the last declarative data loading thing, and the answer there is like obviously no. Obviously no. So those are the things that maybe we should think more about, the escape hatches.
Yeah. Yep.
And then if we're feeling better about like yes to those questions, and maybe it's like, okay, let's really tighten up the API, make it high level.
That is interesting. And it is also interesting just playing with GraphQL the way we have, and like and thinking about the parts of Ember data and Storefront that we like with the declarative data fetching and stuff. And it feels like there's a huge gap there, but it also feels like GraphQL is flexible, but it doesn't let you write the kind of code you want to be writing all the time. There's still unanswered questions there, as opposed as far as things like the identity map and dealing with stale data go, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Doesn't really have an answer for that. So it feels like there are missing primitives, definitely missing primitives as far as giving you an expressive way to express your data needs, and how long you can go displaying stale data and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, very, very interesting. Lots of things.
Bring it back to Gatsby for a second. Like I said, I was super happy with like the whole experience, and I was thinking of like other websites we've built in the past where like this would have been an awesome tool to have. Mm-hmm. And I think you kind of touched on EmberMap. Mm-hmm. There was a site like I built a few years ago that would pull, like, it was like a Rails app that would download all this data, and then like, it was just Rails views to render it all. And I was thinking like, man, like this would have been great in Gatsby.
No database.
I mean, this app did have a database,
but you wouldn't have needed it.
But I wouldn't need it. I only need, if I only had the database at like build time or deploy time, I would have been fine.
Right.
And so there's definitely like, there's like all these apps that it felt cool. Like, oh man, if this was around then I would have used it.
It would have solved the real problem. Yeah. That's cool.
So
that's cool. Yeah, the idea. I mean, there's so much that's kind of going through my mind right now, but like it's interesting thinking about how what enables the Gatsby way of building things is how often your data changes. You wouldn't use Gatsby to build Slack because you wouldn't rebuild it every time a message got sent. It doesn't make sense.
Right.
And so it doesn't make sense for that. So it's not like the one true architecture.
Yes.
Certainly not.
Yes.
But there's a spectrum, and once the data can be changed so infrequently, then you can benefit a lot from the simplicity of it.
Yeah. And I guess it's true, like, every app over time is going to have data that is going to end up changing more frequently and other data that's not.
Right.
And I wonder, like, does that disqualify you
right.
from Gatsby, or does Gatsby need like a minimum? Like,
it certainly is a little like something to consider, the fact that like if you start off with a site that changes infrequently, but then you want to add comments or played labels, like if EmberMap was a site and we wanted to add the played labels feature, which we just added, what would you do there? You would just...
It would have to be all client side.
Yeah, but then you have two ways of like loading data. Like you have two ways of doing everything. So
and we're using a tool that's not meant for what we're trying to do.
I mean, we do fast boot and cache the public parts of all of our sites so that bots can render them and they're fast on load. So that would equivalently basically be what Gatsby would be responsible for. So that makes sense. It's just, it kind of reminds you how nice it is. Like if your runtime generation of the page, which is dynamic, like something like a vanilla Rails app with a database, can actually make the site fast enough at request time. There's something beautiful about that because you can just keep going with it. And like it can get you won't ever have to say no to things because you have a database and you have like a fresh paint of the thing at request time. Like there's actually something very beautiful about that architecture because you can add anything that's fully dynamic to it.
You have maximum flexibility.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So
yeah, you can steer the ship in any direction. So
yes.
yeah, that's true. If I knew I was building a content site, then yes, Gatsby. But if it's like, oh, I'm building an app, but it doesn't really change that much, then maybe I would say no to Gatsby then, because the mental model is an app and there could always be...
Oh, can you add this? Oh, just a dashboard with this little value that shows us the latest whatever,
Yeah. And I'm sure there's ways you can shoehorn it in.
Yeah.
But yeah, you want that flexibility, that optionality.
Yeah. It's like the meta conversation here is like Rails is the high level app architecture thing. And then the lower level thing is like, oh, you have an Ember app or a Vue app or a React app, and you have an API server and you have like a content server. And it's like, you want the high level thing that lets you keep going and you can go down to those pieces when you want. But right now, there's a huge switching cost.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like it's like what we have. Like you want the cache that is like generated by Node, and then it like, but it busts if you change it, but you don't have to like completely change your architecture to get that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great because something like Slack, you have to make all those architectural decisions up front, and you want the tool that just lets you slowly opt into them as you need them.
Exactly. And the problem with Rails, while it's like a good thing for server rendered apps, is like it can't build Slack with it. Like if you do, there's not a nice layering story. It's a whole new way of doing it to get something like whatever you're using, Stimulus or TurboLinks or whatever it is. It's not the same.
Yeah.
You want to start with like the...
I mean, this goes without saying, but it's not. You can't do it in this tech. It's is this the happy path?
Yeah, exactly.
Or are you going to pull your hair out?
It's pretty interesting if like there'd be a happy path solution that's like on the one hand static site, on the other like Slack, and there's like just smooth from one to the other, and you would never have to like completely change your architecture. There's a database, but it can be cached, and it can be a flexible query language, but it can be, it can be cached, so it can be fast for things that are like static, or we can preload this part of the page and do this at the client, but like it's always just...
I mean, I think the answer here is UI apps that do a good job emulating server rendered apps, because UI apps can do all this.
They don't have no limitations as far as that is concerned.
The problem with UI apps are the things that we always talk about on this podcast, but like you have to have two apps and two code bases, all this stuff, and there's just little death by 1,000 cuts everywhere. But if we can smooth out all those things, I think UI apps win.
Yeah, I like that. I like UI apps. That's like a good way to think about it. Although like everyone say they're building a UI app, but I guess not really. I think
we need UI apps. No.
Yeah.
We need some acronym.
We need something
like UIA. I don't know.
This is why you don't write the marketing copy for our projects.
It's got to be cool and trendy. has to be something that you can say at a meetup and everyone's like, oh, what's that? I haven't heard of that.
Yeah, jam. And it's true, like, it's true, like, SPA.
I'm more of a jelly stack guy, but you do you.
SPA is an implementation detail. It's not the point. The point is like, there's something that UI apps get at a little bit more closely, but it's not quite right. But it's like, yeah, you're building something that you're using a tool that could build something. We've been rambling for like 3 hours, right?
So good. If you're still listening to this podcast, you're our ideal customer.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. We've cast a spell on you somehow. If you can build Things app, like Things app on Mac, it's like not. That's like to me is like a great example of something like Slack is crazy. Slack is crazy. It's crazy complex. It's like multi-user, real time, all this crazy stuff. Things to me is a nice litmus test of the question, is the technology you're using capable of building like a UI app, right? Because like Things has lots of very nice, rich, subtle interaction and animation. It's one user, so like it works on the phone and stuff, so there's like multiple clients there. That's not really the point. The point I'm making is like it would be hard to reproduce that with like a Rails app, but you do obviously want a database because it's a CRUD app. So that disqualifies like a static React app that's like could be used for like an SVG viewer, yep. Right? Or generator or gradient generator because there's no content behind it. It's not persistent. So Things is like a persistent app, but it has a very rich, nice UI. And so like, what's the technology you can use to build that in a way that's like very easy and doesn't have 2-app problem and doesn't have all that stuff. So like, that's what I want. That's the kind of app I want to. I want to build websites that feel more like those, like that kind of app.
It's really good. There's you're not overcomplicating it, but there's persistence.
Right.
There's being used on multiple computers.
Because I think those are like the main things. When you look at most of the web apps that people are working on, those are the main things that you need. And like the stuff that's really crazy, okay, we can just ignore that for now. Let's just ignore that for now. And if you need that, if you need to use Elixir, because you need whatever you're building WhatsApp, that's fine. I'm okay with saying that my stack doesn't cover that case. But like vanilla Rails app doesn't cover my case either.
Yeah, good CRUD story, good animations.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely.
It's really the back end piece that's like missing a big part of it. Anyways, we can talk about this for the next 5 hours. So,
all right, miragejs.com.
Yeah,
check it out.
That'll be ready, even if we might be tired next week.
You just winced so hard
because I know I'm gonna hate it whenever we launch it. I'm just gonna hate everything about it because I've already been like staring at like these stupid little details and I just hate them. So it's just gonna suck.
Man, I pulled up the site on my Retina laptop, and it was beautiful. I mean, it really was. Just the fonts, everything was so sharp, and
it's all the stuff I didn't do.
No, seriously, I was just like, man, I'm so happy
that
I'm so happy the way this looks.
Nice.
I think it's really easy to. Yeah, last week we were discussing fonts, and I think it's really easy to say use system fonts,
right,
and go for a little worse design. And I just was like, man, I'm really happy we listened to the designers.
Yeah,
because it looks beautiful.
Nice. All right, well, we'll see how the next week goes. I'll be back with some coffee in a week, and hopefully miragejs.com will be live.
Nice.
All right, everyone, thanks for joining us.
See ya.
See ya.